Hey, it's Mike at digitalnomad.net. If you've watched any of my videos recently, the long forms, you know I'm getting into a deep dive on what's going on with the world. And is the US about to be destroyed and collapsed? Many people think so. Let's get right into this video from, who is this? Damon Cassidy. And I'm a subscriber. The link will be down below.
According to the congressional budget, U.S. debt is now projected to increase by 63% within the next
Super
decade,
high,
becoming the highest recorded
unsustainable.
debt in all of human history. And as the dollar has lost roughly 90% of its purchasing power, the top
Thanks to money
1%
printing.
alone now hold more wealth than America's entire working class, raising the question,
Did you hear
how
that?
long can a nation survive?
The ultra wealthy hold more wealth than the entire working class. I think it's like the more than the bottom 50% or something like that. It just keeps getting worse. And guess what? Those people that are super wealthy, they run corporations which run the world.
As it continuously bankrupts its own people. While America may not fully resemble the empires of the past, as it lacks direct control over other nations and is not ruled by a single emperor, the global reach of its unmatched military power, economic dominance, and cultural influence, hidden behind the invisible thumb of the dollar, has placed the United States on the same inevitable trajectory that has defined every superpower throughout history, most notably seen in the internal decay that marked the fall of Rome. Following decades of military conflict, political divide, and immense wealth inequality,
I would say, listen to the immense wealth inequality. Now, I don't know if this is all correct in terms of Rome. I don't know my history that well, and that's why I think this video is valuable. But take a look. If anything's not right, please let me know down there in the comments.
That led to the collapse of the Roman Republic, Emperor Augustus ushered in a period of extraordinary peace and economic stability, where under his rule, he redistributed wealth by using his own money to purchase land for veterans, increased taxes on Rome's elites to fund one of the earliest pension systems, restored civic pride by employing tens of thousands of Romans to famously transform Rome from a city of brick into one of marble, and provided millions of Romans grain to sustain their families, emphasizing how prosperity is rooted in long-term investment and public stability. However, following Rome's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, the first structural cracks in the empire's foundation began to emerge as it profoundly altered how Roman citizens perceived their own strength and the true intentions of their power, signaling just how damaging disastrous campaigns of control and influence can be on decades of prosperity. Following the death of Augustus, Emperor Tiberius adopted a more conservative ideology by significantly reducing government spending, despite the Roman economy's dependence on state intervention, reigniting widespread inequality.
Reducing government spending seems to be what's happening right now under the current administration.
Unemployment and crumbling infrastructure. But the most defining moment of his reign came after he demanded creditors to invest heavily in Italian land, which sparked a massive surge in credit, drove interest rates higher, inflated a real estate bubble, and ultimately collapsed Rome's housing market, where this fallout also triggered defaults.
A lot of people are thinking that the housing market in the US is about to collapse. What do you think? Let me know. I mean, we are at the highest level of unaffordability ever from a purchase perspective.
Closures throughout Rome's largest financial institutions, bringing wealthy families to ruin, paralyzing trade, driving up unemployment, and eventually forcing Tiberius into a massive no-interest bailout to rescue the banks and elite creditors, revealing how the cost of concentrated wealth and over-leveraged economies ultimately
could happen again.
Public. And while the empire eventually recovered, this moment marked the early ignition of a slow compounding decay that would define the fall of Rome. The centuries that followed were plagued by excessive spending, hedonistic political leaders, unprecedented currency debasement, a lack of internal investment, outsourced labor.
Okay, again, if you know any about this, he's running through it very quickly because we don't want to waste any time. Let me know if there's anything that is inaccurate about what he's saying there in the comments.
Endless war, immense wealth inequality, and a slow erosion of moral fabric, where after periods of
moral fabric. Does anybody tell the truth anymore? Does anybody even give someone the benefit of the doubt that they're telling the truth on anything anymore? And I would include the food system in all that too.
Fear economic collapse or civil war, a new leader would emerge, promising Res Publica Restituta to restore Rome to its former greatness. Emperor Severus, for example, ironically minted coins bearing the title Restitutor Urbis, or restorer of the city, despite devaluing Rome's currency even further by...
All you got to do, in case you're not aware of how this happens, is print more money, produce more money, put it in the circulation. It devalues everything. It's supply and demand. The value of the currency is supply and demand. So you need to find, respite in some safer assets than currency, and that's usually when it collapses, when everyone does that.
Flooding the markets with the newly minted coinage and accelerating inflation, where the Roman poet Juvenal would later summarize Rome's internal decay, writing, "If the old emperor had been surreptitiously smothered, The same crowd in the moment would have hailed their new Augustus. They shed their sense of responsibility long ago, when they lost their votes and the bribes. The mob that used to grant power, high office, the legions, everything, curtails its
Lost their votes and the bribes. That's probably an analogy to lobbying, which is legal corruption in the US system. It's pervasive.
desires and reveals its anxieties for two things only: bread and circuses. For if you give them food and entertainment, they will never
Food and
revolt.
entertainment.
And while Rome believed each crisis was only temporary, every bailout, every short-term fix, and every
And also notice that goods from China at the dollar store have never been cheaper. This is one of the things. Certain things have never been cheaper. Entertainment, Netflix, streaming 24/7, et cetera, et cetera. But everything else that's really important is expensive now. Regular, real food, regular, actual shelter, all these things. But there are, ways to avoid that. That's low-cost areas of the U.S. There still are a few of them, and of course, lower-cost countries.
self-announced political savior only pushed the empire further down a path it could never return from, a pattern that would later reemerge in the rise of the United States. Since officially becoming the world's leading superpower in 1945, America's forward-thinking industrial investments, combined with being the only major power not forced to rebuild after the war, ushered in a period of immense prosperity, but with a growing appetite for endless war and
Oh, and by the way, I've mentioned this in other videos. If you wanted to see what the U.S. baby boom generation looked like, because I wasn't alive then, I was born in 1970, I'm 55 years young, just go to Uganda. Denise and I just went there in December. We're going again. We have a health optimization safari. If you want to join us, the average woman in Uganda has 6 kids. It's a totally different vibe over there like you wouldn't believe.
implicit control. The United States created a perfect condition for a new ideology to flourish, one that slowly shifted power away from the people and into the hands of the corporations and governmental institutions, where as a result, we abandoned the accountability once demanded.
Is that in any of the history books? I'm curious that the government slowly shifted the power away from the people and into the hands of the institutions, because that is 100% accurate.
By leaders like JFK, or the moral warnings of Martin Luther King Jr.
And I submit that if we can spend $35 billion a year to fight an ill-considered war in Vietnam and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, our nation can spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth.
Instead, we placed our trust into slogans, most notably Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign, "Let's make America great again," forcing the nation to live in a state of endless remembrance rather than deliberate planning, effectively selling out future generations in pursuit of a ghost from the past. And while history may not repeat
And
itself,
this is all on the endless productivity increases, the endless, you close one door behind you, there's another one you can open. You keep going, keep going. I think we've reached the end of that. I think that Ponzi scheme or that pyramid scheme, which is what it's turning out that everything here in late stage capitalism is suddenly being realized by a lot of people.
it often rhymes, with the United States almost perfectly replicating the key events of the early Roman Empire. However, a substantial differentiator lies in the simple fact that despite Rome severely debasing its currency, it remains largely tied to tangible value. When Augustus transitioned Rome from a republic and into an empire, the denarius contained roughly 98% of silver, where it took nearly 300 years for it to fall to just 0.5%. Where since the US removed the dollar from gold with the collapse of the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971, the dollar has lost 88% of its purchasing power.
Well, also keep in mind, if you don't know about coin collecting, numismatist stuff, the coins themselves used to be made out of silver, the ones we had, and gold too. But now they're made out of almost worthless metals. And in many cases, actually, the metals are worth more than the coin, like in the penny, but it's still virtually worthless.
And roughly 99% of its value when compared to gold, forcing the nation to enter the highest levels of debt in human history, backed by a currency rooted entirely in trust. A trust that is now deteriorating at an unprecedented rate.
Yeah. Trust, because does anyone believe anyone out there anymore? I mean, is there anyone that doesn't lie constantly, it seems like? There is no trust. Definitely a crisis of trust. And if that's all that's holding this house of cards together, it's probably going to collapse.
As the country continues to march towards moral bankruptcy. And while Rome may offer the most iconic warning, it's the British Empire that most clearly parallels the structural consequences of outsourcing domestic strength in pursuit of global control. After becoming the first nation in history to undergo large-scale industrialization in the 18th century, producing over 2/3 of the world's coal, half of its iron, and 40% of its steel, Britain used this economic dominance and its unmatched naval power to construct undersea cables for a global telegraphic network, opening its financial markets to easier flows of foreign capital. For between 1865 and 1914, British investors poured as much money into the infrastructure of Africa, Asia, and Latin America as they did into the United Kingdom itself.
They did that, and actually Uganda, I mentioned here, the official language of Uganda is English because it was a British colony.
Resulting in overseas ventures consistently delivering higher returns than domestic enterprises, allowing Britain's elite to profit immensely, while the working class experienced little to no upward mobility. Where William Kennedy of the London School of Economics estimated that redirecting even a fraction of Britain's foreign investment back into domestic manufacturing could have increased national income by 25 to 50%, potentially creating the kind of middle-class growth the United States experienced after World War II. But instead, as financial institutions and overseas profits were prioritized, local industries decayed, wages stagnated, and working-class neighborhoods across northern England fell into long-term decline. And while Britain poured its limited domestic...
In a way, this person's saying that trade caused this. Bringing other folks in caused this. And I don't think he's pointing it out, but it has in many ways because like even the tech jobs, they're easily outsourced to other countries who are now become educated in technology and can work through the internet at vastly reduced rates. And then, of course, U.S. workers have to compete with them.
Resources into defending a sprawling empire, the United States, benefiting from geographic insulation and cultural isolationism, strengthened its industrial base and delayed entry into global conflicts, where two world wars not only drained Britain's treasury, but physically devastated its already limited manufacturing core, further reducing its capacity for post-war recovery. And as industrial towns collapsed under privatization, foreign competition, and cultural neglect, Britain fundamentally shifted towards a service-based economy, handing the keys of industrial dominance to America and signaling the long-term consequences of an empire that abandons its working class.
And guess where we are? We are in a service economy, right? I guess that's where he's going with this.
As global power shifted in the post-war era, it was the American factory worker who became the symbol of national strength. From Detroit's factories producing over 60% of the world's automobiles, to Pennsylvania mills outproducing Germany and Japan combined, blue-collar labor powered the U.S. economy and built the infrastructure that defined American ingenuity.
And those were all jobs with defined benefit retirement plans, the traditional pension. You work for 30 years, you don't have to worry about stuff. Workers were taken care of in that regard.
But in the pursuit of containing communism, the Korean War redirected billions of dollars in special procurement contracts to Japan, turning it into a supply base for U.S. forces and jump-starting its industrial recovery. And rather than reinforcing its own industrial foundation, Cold War tensions and the growing obsession with corporate cost-cutting led the United States to gradually abandon it, trading national resilience for geopolitical leverage and corporate efficiency, while Japan emerged as the world's second-largest free market economy by 1968. And by the late 1970s, following President Jimmy Carter's reduction of tariffs on Chinese imports, American companies had an even greater incentive to source from or produce overseas, shifting the national mentality that American jobs were no longer foundational assets, but disposable costs to be minimized. And as worsening economic inequality and civil divide began tearing apart the nation, Reagan's promise of restoring America to its former greatness created the perception of change, despite increased government debt, a total reduction of social safety nets, and more than 1.6 million American jobs being outsourced overseas, placing even further downward pressure on domestic job quality. And after decades of industrial decline, the 1990s marked the most substantial transformation of the post-war economic structure under President Bill.
And I always thought that what the U.S. was doing was taking the jobs nobody wanted and giving them to others who could benefit more in other countries, and then what would be left for the people in the U.S. would be higher paying, higher quality jobs that people wanted to do. That was my take on all this he's describing, but obviously it doesn't seem like it worked out like that at all.
Clinton, where trade agreements like NAFTA and the establishment of permanent normal trade relations with China fundamentally opened U.S. markets to aggressive import competition, where between 1994 and 2001,
cheap goods for
over
people,
879,000 American jobs
for the US.
were officially certified as lost to direct trade competition under the U.S. government's Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, with some economists estimating that the real number was likely 2 to 3 times higher, gutting areas like Detroit, which fell from one of the wealthiest cities in the world to one of the poorest in the United States, with a poverty rate of 31.5%. And as U.S. further embraced globalization and cost-cutting strategies, it once again followed the same pattern that has defined the collapse of every major empire, where today, China stands as the world's sole manufacturing superpower, accounting for 35% of global gross production, or more than the next
What do you think about that? Let me know in the comments. Same pattern?
9 largest manufacturers combined. And while the United States is taking drastic efforts to reignite its industrial base in an attempt to preserve global leadership, it's being forced to do so on top of a corporate infrastructure designed solely to maximize short-term efficiency at the lowest possible cost, signaling that while domestic manufacturing is essential to long-term prosperity, it must now operate within the very mindset that dismantled it. And with virtually no internal investment or national job training pipeline, American manufacturing is projected to face more than 2 million unfilled jobs by 2030.
Yeah, that's the thing. There are jobs here for people, and I think that that's going to be the sweet spot. It's kind of like a little rebirth of the American dream again in some of these categories.
Per gap that could cost as much as $1 trillion annually, all while the U.S. is simultaneously facing an infrastructure disaster. According to the 2025 report card for America's infrastructure, if current funding levels remain unchanged, the country will face a $3.7 trillion shortfall by 2030. But if we include dams, levees, hazardous and solid waste systems, parks, and schools, the number rises to $4.4 trillion. However, unlike the transition of power from the British Empire, where America was economically and culturally primed to take the mantle, China faces a number of structural challenges, with the first one being that it's already shifting away from manufacturing and towards a service-based economy, as rising labor costs have eroded one of the key advantages that once made China an attractive hub for global production, where simultaneously, its population is declining at an unprecedented rate.
That's another thing, subject of many of my videos is the birth crisis, the population crisis, the fertility crisis. That's definitely a factor here.
As a consequence of the one-child policy, 1 in 4
and not just for China, but for almost everybody.
Chinese citizens will be over the age of 60 by 2030. By 2050, that figure is expected to reach 40%, placing an even greater strain on retirement and healthcare systems than what the United States is projected to face.
Everybody's going to have this problem,
hidden liabilities,
except for places like sub-Saharan Africa.
Has placed China's true government debt ratio at 117%, just 7% below that of the United States. And similar to how economists once predicted that Japan would surpass the US by the year 2000, similar forecasts made in 2008 that China would overtake the US by this year have now been pushed to the 2040s, with growing doubts that it will actually happen at all, signaling that unless the United States faces a severe economic or global catastrophe, it remains on a trajectory far more reflective of Rome's bread and circuses, where collapse no longer arrives in the form of burning cities or toppled statues, but through an abandoned workforce, broken trust, and a generation that no longer sees a future worth building. Because throughout American history, the nation has fundamentally relied on outside enemies to inspire internal unity. But as the country has become so ideologically twisted, it's now collapsing inward, where the enemy is anyone who doesn't align with one's personal beliefs. Republican fingers point downward at those deemed responsible for social and economic decay, while Democratic fingers point upward at the elite, blind to the fact that their beloved politicians are also seated at the table of greed, where decades of policy failure and the complete loss of social cohesion have not only bankrupted emerging generations,
there's a lot here, a lot to process.
But their children as well. We prioritize the intricacies of AI in Apple's latest phone release, while nearly 50 million children remain trapped in an education system completely unprepared for the demands of the future, facing lower reading scores than in 1971, and with just 56% of fourth graders actually performing at grade levels in math. We blame minimum wage for rising prices, despite CEO stock-based compensation soaring 1,460%, while hourly wages have grown by just 17.5%. We worship media figures who selectively weaponize data to fit their own narrative, while they avoid the fact that homelessness has surged by 30% in just 3 years, and that childhood poverty has nearly doubled since 2022. Millennials and Gen Z are cast as society.
This is covered in another video I just did about the loss of the American dream, and yeah, this is a serious issue. But there are areas of the U.S. that are inexpensive, and there are other countries, which is why the U.S. may fall, that are a better deal now, way better deal than the U.S.
The scapegoat, despite living through the most unaffordable housing market in American history, all while holding just a fraction of the wealth their parents had. And yet we wonder why national pride has collapsed from 85% to 18% in just the last decade, as we continue to plunge into endless wars, utter political
Do you believe these statistics?
all while the very fabric of society has been torn apart since 2020, leaving the future to appear as one only defined by greed, disillusionment, and further chaos. And while the public has been trained to remain passive, we've forgotten that what actually made America great was the collective pursuit of a better tomorrow. It was the everyday.
That's right. I totally get this. There's no unifying sentiment anymore. And that's why, like, we do work through our nonprofit. We say that we are improving society for future generations because most people are chronically ill. This person's not even getting into the health issue, but it's super important. Aplantbaseddiet.org, aplantbaseddiet.org is our nonprofit, and plantbasedvideos.info will take you straight to the aplantbaseddiet.org YouTube channel. But it's a serious, serious issue too. This is unsustainable. It didn't used to be like this.
Americans who chose to stand up for what they believed was right, not through the cowardice of violence, but through the strength of unity, pursuing hope rather than hate. As it wasn't elected officials who ended the working class living in slums, it was Jacob Riis, a photographer who exposed the horrors of tenement housing and how the other half lives, prompting New York to pass a landmark housing reform in 1890. The promise of draining the swamp was fulfilled not by politicians, but by Lincoln Steffens, a journalist who exposed municipal corruption in Tweed days in St. Louis, launching a national muckraking movement in 1902. The reason you were able to actually have a childhood wasn't because of industry or government suddenly finding empathy. It was because of Carmela Tioli, a 13-year-old girl who, despite having her scalp torn off in a cotton machine, still testified before Helen Taft, which ignited a national child labor reform movement in 1912. And the monopolies of the Gilded Age didn't just collapse out of hopeful thinking, they were broken by Ida Tarbell, who spent years exposing John D. Rockefeller's empire, leading to the dissolution of Standard Oil, signaling that while the American empire may live on as a global shell company, for it to
we already know the oligarchy is here and no one's dismantling it.
Actually become great again, it must be rebuilt in the service of future generations, demanding that we find hope in one another and use whatever strength we have left to redefine what it truly means to be an American. And while I am so unbelievably grateful to be in the position to receive such kind and love.
All right, well, he's just going to go on. There we go. This was an amazing, amazing compilation of how we've gotten here. And which is, what's his name? Let me see. Cancel. Sorry about that. Damon has excellently compiled and put together this history lesson, assuming that it's correct, of course. That's what's gone, is the corporations run everything, and there's no sense of unity. There's no shared mission. There's no shared values. Nobody trusts anybody anymore. And we hope that we're doing that through our plantbaseddiet.org nonprofit and the work that we're doing. We see this as an issue for sure. And the reason why, like I said, he didn't even point it out here in his video, I wish he did, is people's health. People have never been this sick. The longevity, the lifespan of people is dropping, the average person, when it could be increasing. But it's because of this awful negative feedback loop that we're trapped in. And I'm an optimist. I think it can get better. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video. And please share this with somebody that needs to be woken up as to what's going on.